He insulted a woman in a hospital corridor without thinking twice, and she made sure the entire board of directors heard about it. That was the version of events Donovan Kerr had been living with for 11 days before he found out her name was Dr. Mara Stilling, and that she had just been assigned to the hospital he was sent to save. The morning it started, Donovan had been awake since 4, not by choice. His body had developed the inconvenient habit of refusing sleep past that hour ever since the board of Meridian Health Group had handed him a file thick enough to use as a doorstop and told him that St. Clement's Community Hospital in Halifax was hemorrhaging money at a rate that would close it within 18 months. That was 6 weeks ago. Since then, he had been running on coffee, spreadsheets, and a quiet, bone-deep dread that he never let anyone see. He was walking fast that Tuesday morning, the way he always walked through hospitals, coat over his arm, phone in his hand, eyes moving across everything at once. The corridors of St. Clement's smelled of floor cleaner and something older underneath it, the particular exhaustion of a building that had been running past capacity for years. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Half the chairs in the waiting area had been replaced with folding ones borrowed from the chapel downstairs. He turned a corner near the supply wing and nearly collided with a woman coming the other way. She was carrying a stack of patient charts that reached her chin, a reusable coffee cup balanced on top. He stepped aside. She stepped the same way. The coffee cup tilted, and Donovan caught it by instinct, but not before a thin line of dark coffee ran down the front of her white coat, he said, without pausing, without really looking at her. You might want to watch where you're going. There was a silence behind him that he did not notice until he was already 3 steps away. Excuse me. He turned. She was younger than the gray circles under her eyes suggested. Dark hair pulled back, coffee soaking through the fabric over her sternum, charts now balanced against the wall beside her. Her expression was not angry. It was the more dangerous thing, completely composed. You walked into me, she said. I moved aside. You moved into me, and then told me to watch where I was going. She looked at him with the kind of steady attention that most people reserve for something they intend to remember. I don't know who you are, but that's not how we speak to people in this building. Donovan was already running late for a meeting that would determine which of 3 wings to defund first. He was not in the mood. He said something about efficiency and not having time for this and walked away. He did not think about it again until Thursday afternoon, when the chief of medicine, Dr. Reginald Okafor, set a printed complaint on the desk between them and said, without expression, "Do you want to read it, or should I summarize?" Donovan, read it. Dr. Mara Stilling, staff physician, emergency medicine. The complaint was precise, professional, and had been copied to 3 members of the board. It described the encounter in the hallway with careful accuracy and asked only one thing: that the unnamed individual who had spoken to her that way be identified and required to apologize in writing. She had not asked for anything punitive. She had not exaggerated. She had simply written down exactly what happened and submitted it through proper channels. Donovan set the paper down. Find out her schedule, he said. I'll talk to her. Dr. Okafor looked at him over the rim of his glasses. Her schedule is the problem. She hasn't had a day off in 14 days. Donovan found out the rest over the next 48 hours, the way he always gathered information, quietly, indirectly, listening to what people said in hallways when they forgot he was there. Dr. Mara Stilling had been at St. Clement's for 6 years. She had trained downtown, could have stayed downtown and had chosen not to. She ran a free evening clinic out of the hospital's underused East Wing every Thursday, serving patients who worked double shifts and couldn't take a Tuesday morning appointment at a family doctor's office. She had written 3 grants for community health programs, 2 of which had been approved before the hospital's funding crisis had frozen all discretionary budgets. She was, by every account, the reason a significant portion of the hospital's most vulnerable patients kept coming back instead of slipping through the cracks entirely. She was also, Donovan learned on his 4th day of listening, the most vocal internal critic of the restructuring plan his team had submitted to the board. He found her on a Friday evening in the East Wing, long after the department heads had left for the weekend. The Thursday clinic had run late, apparently. The waiting room had 2 patients still in chairs, and she was standing at the triage desk talking to a teenager in a too big sweatshirt, her voice low and unhurried, as though she had nowhere else to be and no intention of suggesting otherwise. Donovan waited. When the teenager left with a referral slip and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a handwritten list of community services, Mara Stilling turned around and saw him. She did not look surprised. She looked, if anything, mildly interested in the same way a person might look at an approaching weather system, something to be assessed, not feared. "Mr. Kerr," she said. "Dr. Stilling." He had the letter in his breast pocket. He did not take it out immediately. "I owe you an apology." "You do." She picked up a chart. "That's not why you're here, though." It wasn't a question. Donovan found that he respected it. "No," he said. She set the chart down. "I've read the restructuring proposal. Specifically, the section recommending the closure of the East Wing and the discontinuation of the Thursday clinic. The East Wing operates at 31% capacity during scheduled hours." Her voice was patient and precise. "The Thursday clinic sees 40 to 60 patients per session. None of those interactions appear in your capacity figures because the clinic isn't formally integrated into the hospital's billing system. It was set up as a community program, which means it doesn't generate revenue, which means to your spreadsheet, it doesn't exist." Donovan looked at her. "I've been trying to get it formally integrated for 2 years," Mara continued. "Every time I submit the paperwork, it goes into a queue that the administration doesn't have the staffing to process, so it stays invisible. And now the recommendation is to close the wing because it looks empty." The fluorescent light above them buzzed once and steadied. Down the hall, someone was wheeling a cart over the older section of linoleum that had a small ridge in it, and the wheels made a rhythmic clinking sound. "Tell me what you need to make it visible," Donovan said. Mara Stilling looked at him for a long moment. It was the same look she'd given him in the hallway, the one that took inventory. Then she opened a drawer in the triage desk and pulled out a manila folder that was very clearly not a spontaneous document. "I've had this ready for 8 months," she said, and handed it to him. He took it home that night and read every page. It was meticulous. Patient volume data, community health outcomes, cost per intervention figures that would have impressed a health economist. She had documented everything. She had simply never had anyone willing to receive it. He went back to the East Wing the following Thursday and sat in the waiting room while the clinic ran. He wore a regular jacket, not the coat he wore when he was functioning as a Meridian executive, and most people seemed to take him for a patient or a family member waiting for someone inside. He watched, he counted. He listened to fragments of conversation between a grandmother explaining her symptoms to a volunteer interpreter, between a young man asking about what a referral actually meant in practical terms, between a nurse named Carla who had been working the clinic unpaid for 4 years because, as she mentioned to a colleague without apparent self-consciousness, where else was she going to be on a Thursday evening? He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. He did not tell Mara he was doing this. She found out anyway, because she was the kind of person who noticed things, and she mentioned it on the 4th week, in the same straightforward way she seemed to handle most things. She handed him a clipboard and told him he might as well make himself useful. He held the clipboard for 2 hours and triaged intake forms. It was not a skill set he had used since his residency in internal medicine, which was longer ago than he usually chose to think about, and a different chapter of his life. A chapter he had closed when the administrative career had begun, and told himself he had no regrets about. He did not tell Mara about the residency, not yet. What he did tell her, 3 weeks into the Thursday evenings and after a particularly long session that had run until nearly 11, was that the restructuring plan was not what it appeared to be. They were standing in the parking lot, the November air sharp, and smelling of salt from the harbor a few blocks west. She was wrapping a scarf around her collar with the brisk efficiency of someone who spent a lot of time in parking lots in November. "The proposal the board approved isn't the whole picture," he said. Mara stopped moving. She looked at him across the roof of her car. "The East Wing closure is in the proposal," she said. "I read it. You read Phase 1. He watched her face. "There's a Phase 2. The board hasn't seen it." The silence that followed had weight to it. "Tell me," she said. He did not tell her everything. Not that night. He told her enough, that the cuts in Phase 1 were engineered to generate a specific kind of pressure, the kind that would force a provincial health authority conversation that had been stalled for 4 years. That the East Wing, if it remained open and formally integrated, had a funding pathway through a federal community health initiative that no one had activated because the hospital's administration had never been stable enough or organized enough to submit the application. That Phase 2 was built entirely around that application, and that the East Wing's continued operation was, in fact, the cornerstone. Mara leaned against her car door. The parking lot lights cast everything in amber. "You've been letting everyone think you're here to gut this place," she said. "The board needs to believe the situation is worse than it is," Donovan said. "If I tell them there's a federal funding solution, they'll spend 6 months in committee trying to take credit for it before anyone submits anything. The application has a window. It closes in February. So you're lying to the board. I'm managing the sequence of information." She looked at him. It was not a charitable look. "That is what lying is, Mr. Kerr, when you're doing it to the people responsible for governing the institution." He did not argue. He said, "If you tell anyone about Phase 2, the board panics, pulls the application timeline into committee, and misses the window. St. Clement's closes in 18 months on schedule, and the Thursday clinic closes with it." The harbor wind moved between them. "How long have you been doing this?" Mara said. Not a question about Phase 2, something else. He could hear it. "Doing what?" "Carrying things alone." She tilted her head slightly. "You came back 3 Thursdays in a row and held a clipboard and never told me you used to practice medicine. Dr. Okafor mentioned it. He seemed to think I already knew." Donovan was quiet for a moment. "It was a long time ago," he said. "Why did you stop?" The November air was very cold. He had an answer to that question that he had given at dinner parties and in professional biographies for 15 years. It was clean and reasonable and said nothing. He gave her the other answer instead. He wasn't entirely sure why. He told her about the hospital in Winnipeg where he had done his residency, a public facility serving a neighborhood that looked, in certain specific ways, not entirely unlike the one St. Clement's served. He told her about the year the provincial government had cut the facility's operating budget by 30%, and he had watched the department heads fight each other over what remained, and the patients bear the cost, and the administration produce memos about strategic realignment. He told her that he had looked at that process and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who is 29 and hasn't yet developed the ability to pretend otherwise, that the people who understood medicine were not the people making the decisions, and that this was not going to change unless someone crossed over. "So I crossed over," he said, "and I told myself it was so I could fix things from the inside." Mara was quiet. "And have you?" she said. It was the most honest question anyone had asked him in several years. "Working on it," he said. She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, "Show me the Phase 2 documents." He did, the following Tuesday, in his office with the door closed. She sat across his desk and read for 90 minutes without speaking. He worked on the federal application in the meantime, the parts he could complete without the hospital's formal sign-off. When she finished, she set the last page down and was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone who has just had something they believed confirmed and resented. "The cross-subsidy model," she said. "If the application is approved, the East Wing expansion is funded by a combination of federal transfer and a proportion of revenue from the new private diagnostic suite on the 3rd floor. 40% of net revenue from the diagnostic suite goes into a locked community health fund," Donovan said. "The board can't touch it. It's structured as a condition of the federal grant. The board approved the diagnostic suite because they think it's a profit center. It is a profit center. It's also an engine." Mara looked at him. The expression on her face was not simple. It was the complicated kind, the kind that arrives when a person has been angry at someone for weeks and finds out, all at once, that the anger was pointed in slightly the wrong direction. "You let me submit that complaint," she said. "You were right to submit it. I was rude to you. I've been telling every department head in this building that you're here to dismantle it. You were working with the information you had." She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sky over Halifax was doing the flat gray thing it did in November when it couldn't decide between cloud and fog. Below, the hospital's small courtyard had 2 picnic tables and a birch tree that someone had planted in a concrete planter with more optimism than soil. "The Thursday clinic," she said. "In Phase 2, formally integrated. Salaried staff, year-round operation. Carla, the nurse who's been volunteering for 4 years. Yes, there's a position." Mara did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" "The application requires a staff physician co-signature, someone with documented clinical ties to the community program." He paused. "I was hoping you'd already have a file ready." She turned around. There was something in her face that might, in other circumstances, have been a smile. "I have 6, she said. They spent the next 8 weeks working in a way that Donovan had not worked with anyone in years, which was to say, as equals. Mara handled the clinical documentation. He handled the financial architecture. She translated the community health outcomes into the language the federal application required. He restructured the Phase 1 cuts in ways that looked, to the board, like fiscal discipline, and were in fact a careful rerouting of funds toward the diagnostic suite build-out that would become the engine of Phase 2. It was not easy. The board chair, a man named Stuart Vance who had been in his position for 11 years and had the incurious confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything, called Donovan into a meeting in late November and told him the East Wing cuts weren't moving fast enough. Donovan sat across the table and said, "I'm managing the sequencing to protect our liability position. If we close the wing before the provincial audit completes, we expose the board to a community care obligation claim." This was technically true. It was also not the reason he was managing the sequencing. Stuart Vance nodded slowly. He said, "Keep me updated," and moved on to the next agenda item. Donovan walked out of that boardroom and down 2 flights of stairs to the East Wing, where Mara was reviewing application documents at the triage desk. She looked up. "How did it go?" "He bought it." She made a small sound that was not quite satisfaction. "I've been telling my colleagues the restructuring is proceeding on a modified timeline due to regulatory review," she said, "which is also technically true. How do they take it?" "Most of them are relieved. Some of them still think we're both compromised." She looked at him. "Dr. Okafor asked me directly last week whether I trusted you." Donovan waited. "I told him I trusted the work," Mara said. "That I wasn't sure yet about the person." She paused. "I'm more sure now." The federal application was submitted on February 3rd, 11 days before the window closed. Mara co-signed it at the triage desk of the Thursday clinic, surrounded by the specific organized chaos of 42 patients, 2 volunteer interpreters, and Carla, who had shown up as usual and was told, that evening, that there was something she should know about the future of her Thursday nights. Carla cried. This was the only moment in the entire process during which Donovan had to look at the middle distance for several seconds before he could say anything useful. The approval came back in April. He was in his office when the email arrived. He read it twice and then sat very still for a moment before he picked up his phone. Mara answered on the second ring. "We got it," he said. There was a silence on her end. Then she said, "Say it again. We got the funding, the full amount." He heard her exhale. It was a long, quiet sound, the kind that carries everything a person has been holding for months. "I'm in the East Wing," she said. "Come down here." He came down. The wing was quiet in the afternoon lull, the way it got between the morning rush and the evening clinic. Mara was standing near the window at the end of the corridor, the one that looked out over the courtyard with the birch tree. The April light was doing something generous to the concrete and the pale new leaves. She handed him a paper cup of coffee without preamble. He took it. They stood side by side, looking at the courtyard below. "Phase 2 goes to the board on Monday," he said. "How do you think Stuart Vance is going to take it?" "Badly, and then well. Once he understands the diagnostic suite revenue projections, he'll find a way to have been in favor of the whole thing from the beginning." Mara made the small sound again. He had come over 8 weeks to understand that it was the sound she made when something was exactly as absurd as she had predicted. "The community housing application," she said. "Behind the East Wing expansion, 6 months. If the municipality moves on schedule, and if they don't, then I'll go to 3 different provincial ministers and be unpleasant about it until they do." She looked sideways at him. "You're willing to be unpleasant. I've had some experience with it." It was the first time, in 11 days of hallways and parking lots and triage desks and document reviews, that they had made direct reference to the morning it started. The moment sat between them without awkwardness. "I withdrew the formal complaint," she said. "I know. You didn't have to. I didn't do it for you." She looked back at the birch tree. "I did it because the record didn't need to say what you were. I knew by then." The courtyard below was getting the late afternoon light now, the kind that turns ordinary concrete briefly gold. Somewhere in the wing behind them, a door opened and someone called Carla's name in the comfortable, specific tone of an institution that has found its footing again. Donovan looked at the woman beside him, at the coffee cup in her hand, and the new leaves outside and the file she had kept ready for it months because she believed, without any real evidence, that someone would eventually show up willing to receive it. He thought about Winnipeg and the 29-year-old who had crossed over and told himself it was for something. He thought about 11 days of walking past the East Wing without going in, and about the 8th Thursday when he had picked up the clipboard. "I owe you more than an apology letter," he said. Mara turned her head to look at him. The expression on her face was the complicated kind again, but its composition had changed. "You owe me a properly funded community health program," she said. "And you've delivered that, and the rest?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the birch leaves moved in the small wind that came up from the harbor in the afternoons. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said, "when the housing application is in." He nodded. He looked back at the courtyard. It is a peculiar thing to spend years being the person who holds the difficult truth alone and in silence, who wears the face of the problem because it is the only way to move toward the solution. You tell yourself it is pragmatism. You tell yourself sentiment is a luxury the work cannot afford. And then someone hands you a clipboard on a Thursday night and watches you hold it, and something you had very carefully set aside a long time ago begins, quietly and without announcing itself, to return. Donovan Kerr had walked into a hospital corridor 9 weeks ago with a file and a deadline, and the weight of a plan he could not share. He had been rude to a woman with charts and a coffee cup and had not looked back. He was looking now. The courtyard below them was ordinary and bright, and the birch tree was doing exactly what birch trees do in April in Halifax. Returning stubbornly and entirely without drama to everything it had always been capable of being.